This is South Dakota, home to the Wind Cave herd, a group of 250 to 400 iconic North American animals, the bison. This herd is special. It's one of only 7 in the United States where the animals roam freely, just as they did centuries ago. Even more remarkable, these bison carry very few domestic cattle genes, making them crucial to preserving a species that humans nearly drove to extinction. For years, life was peaceful for them here. Protected, thriving, and continuing a fragile lineage that had barely survived the last 2 centuries. But in 2009, something unexpected happened. 23 of these giants were transported far south to the desert plains of northern Mexico. Why? As dramatic as it sounds, they were sent to help repair humanity's mistakes. Let's rewind to see what exactly went wrong and why bison were the ones best suited to fix it. By the late 1800s, the vast North American prairies were teeming with life. Bison herds once roamed here 60 million strong, shaping the ecosystem with every step. But by the mid-19th century, profit-driven hunting, mainly for pelts and meat, paired with slaughterhouses and government policies, triggered a catastrophic collapse. In just a few decades, their numbers plummeted. From 60 million, only 5.5 million remained by 1870. A mere 10 years later, fewer than 400,000 were left. And it got worse. The government's campaign to weaken indigenous tribes included eliminating the animals they depended on, especially bison. By 1889, only 541 remained. A once-dominant species had been reduced to the edge of extinction. In the early 20th century, just 300 bison roamed free in all of the United States, surviving only in isolated protected areas. But the bison's historic range didn't stop at the U.S. border. These towering animals also roamed the northern grasslands of modern-day Mexico. Unfortunately, their fate there was no better. In colonial and post-colonial Mexico, bison were hunted relentlessly for meat, hides, and even their tongues, considered a delicacy and used in crafts. Travel records from as early as the 1500s describe expeditions organizing hunts across what's now the state of Chihuahua. By the 1800s, bison hunting had become a full-blown industry. Newspaper accounts between the 1820s and 1860s reported mass roundups and slaughters. The Cieleros, descendants of Spanish colonists, were key players in this trade. As settlements spread, they pushed deeper into bison territory, wiping out entire herds for profit. By 1870, bison in Mexico faced almost no natural defense. They were nearly gone. By the century's end, free-roaming bison had vanished from the region entirely. And so the age of the prairie engineers came to a close, replaced by a barren landscape where vibrant grasslands once stretched for miles. But the damage didn't end with the animals themselves. In the 20th century, agrarian reforms in Mexico split large prairies into small land plots. Farmers tried raising cattle, but the effort was mostly unprofitable. To salvage their crops, many turned to irrigation, which further damaged the land. The result was devastating: fragmented habitats, overworked soils, and a broken ecosystem. Soon, locals began to notice something disturbing. Without bison, the landscape changed dramatically. Instead of lush grasslands, dense thickets of invasive shrubs took over. The soil, once soft and porous, began hardening into a crust that trapped water on the surface. Rainfall only made things worse, washing away the thin, fertile layer and accelerating erosion. Each year, the region lost up to 0.4 inches of topsoil. Over decades, this slashed pasture productivity and turned vast stretches of prairie into uninhabitable wastelands. Biodiversity suffered too. With native plants disappearing, many animal species struggled to survive. Black-tailed prairie dogs, already hunted heavily by humans, were hit especially hard by the disappearance of bison. Here's one striking example. In 1988, researchers found a colony of prairie dogs covering 136,000 acres in northern Mexico. But by 2004, that area had shrunk by 73%. Their population density dropped from 25 per 2.5 acres to just 2. And with the prairie dogs in decline, other animals, birds, reptiles, small mammals, began vanishing too. That's when Mexico turned to an unexpected solution: bring back the bison. In 2009, 23 bison from South Dakota were transported to the Llanos Biosphere Reserve in Chihuahua. These were areas the species once called home. With U.S. support, those 23 animals began a new chapter in a historic comeback. Over the next decade, their numbers steadily climbed. By 2018, the herd had grown to over 200. But more importantly, their presence began transforming the land. How? It all starts with how bison move. Unlike domestic cattle, who graze lazily in the same spots for long stretches, bison are wild and always alert. They constantly roam in search of food, covering up to 1.8 miles a day. This movement keeps them from trampling the same area too much, breaking up compacted soil, and allowing rainwater to penetrate deeper into the ground. In contrast, cows, who've evolved without predators, tend to overtrample land. Their constant presence leads to hardened soil and water runoff, which further erodes the land. But bison help the soil breathe. Their hooves naturally churn the ground, breaking up crusts and allowing water to soak in. This improves soil moisture, reduces erosion, and helps native grasses take root. And that's just the beginning. Bison also produce enormous amounts of manure, between 50 and 59 pounds per adult per day. While it might sound gross, this waste is a natural fertilizer packed with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And because bison travel constantly, they spread this fertilizer evenly across the landscape. In Colorado, scientists studied soil samples in areas grazed by bison and found something remarkable. Nitrogen levels were 40% higher than in bison-free zones. The result? Rapid regrowth of native grasses and better nutrient cycling. One long-term study found that bison can actually double plant biodiversity across the prairie. Their presence helps native grasses outcompete invasive species and encourages healthy plant communities to flourish. But bison don't just walk and graze, they roll. It may look silly, but when a bison rolls in the dirt, often to cool off or shake off insects, it creates shallow depressions in the ground. These mini craters collect rainwater and trap seeds that hitchhike on the bison's fur. The disturbed soil offers a perfect, competition-free spot for new plants to take root. Some scientists even call bison ecosystem engineers, creatures that unknowingly shape their environment for the better. The benefits ripple outward. Small water-filled pits become micro-wetlands, attracting insects, frogs, and other wildlife. Invasive shrubs are trampled or eaten. And slowly, the landscape begins to look like it once did, before the damage. One major goal of the Llanos project is to restore not just the land, but the animals that depend on it. Chief among them? Prairie dogs. These little rodents thrive in patchy grasslands where some areas are short and others tall. Bison naturally create this pattern. Where they graze heavily, the grass stays short, ideal for prairie dogs who need clear sight lines to spot predators. Where bison haven't been for a while, the grass grows tall, providing habitat for other species. Prairie dogs are more than cute. They build vast underground tunnel networks, aerating the soil and improving water retention. Their digging stirs up nutrients and promotes organic breakdown. And like bison, their waste enriches the soil even further. Incredibly, prairie dogs also help control invasive shrubs by gnawing on young shoots before they can spread. But that's not all. They're essential for one of North America's most endangered predators, the black-footed ferret. This ferret species, once thought extinct, depends almost entirely on prairie dogs for food and shelter. A single ferret family can consume up to 250 prairie dogs a year. They also live in abandoned prairie dog burrows. Without healthy prairie dog populations, ferrets can't survive. That's why restoring bison, and by extension prairie dogs, has huge implications for biodiversity. In fact, after decades of absence, a small, black-footed ferret population was rediscovered in Wyoming in 1981. Since then, conservationists have worked tirelessly to reintroduce and even clone the species. But everyone agrees, no prairie dogs, no ferrets. And then there's the burrowing owl. This unique bird prefers life on the ground and doesn't dig its own home. It occupies prairie dog burrows. Its diet includes insects, lizards, and small rodents, and it thrives in open areas with low vegetation. Prairie dogs help create that environment. Even more fascinating, owls listen in on prairie dog alarm calls to detect danger. It's a brilliant form of cohabitation that benefits both species. So what's the big picture? Bison aren't just big, majestic animals. They're the foundation of an entire ecosystem. Their presence supports prairie dogs, who in turn support ferrets, owls, and dozens of other species. It's all connected. When bison were wiped out, the chain began to collapse. But bringing them back, step by step, is reviving the entire prairie. That's why efforts in places like the Llanos Biosphere Reserve matter so much. By restoring one species, we're creating the conditions for dozens more to thrive again. It's not just about saving bison. It's about healing the land, preserving history, and rebuilding a living, breathing ecosystem, one hoofprint at a time. The North American prairies were once a vast and vibrant ecosystem, teeming with tall grasses, wildflowers, and countless animal species. Among them roamed the iconic American bison, swift foxes, burrowing owls, and small mammals that made the prairies their home. But today, this landscape is among the most damaged ecosystems on the continent. What happened? Centuries of human activity, agriculture, ranching, hunting, and urban development have dramatically reshaped the prairies. Grasslands were plowed under to grow crops. Livestock replaced native grazers. Cities and highways carved up once continuous habitat. And slowly, the web of life that once defined the prairie began to unravel. However, an unlikely hero is now helping to reverse this damage. A small, often misunderstood animal once considered a pest is now at the heart of prairie restoration efforts, the prairie dog. Yes, prairie dogs, those squirrel-sized rodents with high-pitched calls and bustling underground colonies, are turning out to be a keystone species in one of the most important ecological recoveries in North America. But how did a creature so small come to play such a big role in saving an entire ecosystem? Let's explore that story. Before European settlers arrived in North America, prairie dogs thrived across the western plains. From southern Canada to northern Mexico, they inhabited millions of acres of grassland. Some estimates suggest that more than 5 billion prairie dogs lived on the continent prior to the 1800s. Their complex underground burrows and constant grazing helped maintain the prairie's open structure, supporting countless other species. But with the arrival of settlers, everything changed. Settlers saw the prairie not as a delicate ecosystem, but as land to be used. They brought plows, cattle, and fences. Native grasslands were rapidly converted into farmland. Cattle replaced bison, and any animals that interfered with farming or ranching were labeled pests. Prairie dogs were especially targeted. Though they weren't hunted for fur or meat, ranchers viewed prairie dogs as a nuisance. Their burrows, which include chambers for sleeping, raising pups, and hiding from predators, left holes across the land, holes that ranchers feared could injure livestock. Prairie dogs were also accused of eating the grasses that cattle needed to graze. In response, ranchers began exterminating them, first through shooting, later through mass poisoning campaigns. But prairie dogs faced another deadly threat. In the early 1900s, ships arriving from Asia brought rats infected with fleas carrying bubonic plague. The disease spread to prairie dogs, often wiping out entire colonies in days. The plague also increased fear among humans, who pushed for further extermination, fearing the disease could spread to livestock or people. Governments joined in. In the 1980s, South Dakota alone authorized poisoning over 494,000 acres of prairie dog habitat, one of the last major colonies in the U.S. Add to this the steady march of urban sprawl, and prairie dog habitat shrank dramatically. By the early 2000s, it's estimated that 96 to 98% of all prairie dogs had been wiped out, and their range reduced to a mere 5% of its original size. Here's the irony. Much of the extermination was based on myths. Studies have shown that injuries to cattle from prairie dog holes are extremely rare. As for the plague, scientists have found that prairie dogs aren't the carriers, fleas are. In fact, since 1949, out of nearly 500 documented cases of livestock infected with plague, only 23 were even potentially linked to prairie dogs. In other words, prairie dogs were unfairly blamed and almost wiped out for no valid reason. Yet, as prairie dogs disappeared, people began to notice something troubling. The ecosystems they left behind began to collapse. Fast forward to 2008 in southern Arizona, where conservationists took a bold step. The black-tailed prairie dog, once widespread in the region, had been eradicated in the 1960s through poisoning. But researchers had come to understand that the species played a vital role in prairie health. Working with private landowners and government agencies, wildlife officials began reintroducing prairie dogs, starting with 78 individuals relocated from New Mexico. Today, more than 300 prairie dogs have established themselves on 36 acres of restored prairie in Arizona. And their numbers are rising quickly. Prairie dogs breed rapidly when conditions are favorable. A similar story unfolded in Chihuahua, Mexico. Prairie dogs were once common there, too, until agriculture and hunting drove them nearly to extinction by the late 1980s. In their absence, a hardy shrub called mesquite began to spread. With deep roots, mesquite thrives in dry conditions and attracts grazing animals that strip the land of what little grass remains. Without prairie dogs, large swaths of prairie turned into desert-like landscapes and biodiversity plummeted. Then came the reintroduction. As soon as prairie dogs returned, the transformation was dramatic. Prairie dogs actively destroy mesquite because it blocks their view of predators. Within a single year, the mesquite began to vanish. Grasses returned, insects flourished, and wildlife followed. Locals began spotting badgers, pronghorns, and even golden eagles, birds that hadn't been seen in large numbers for decades. Researchers once counted more than 20 golden eagles in a single day. All of it sparked by the comeback of the prairie dog. Prairie dogs are what ecologists call a keystone species. Their impact on the ecosystem is far greater than their numbers might suggest. How? For starters, prairie dogs help maintain grassland structure. They clip and graze on grasses, keeping vegetation short and preventing shrubs and trees from taking over. Their burrowing churns and aerates the soil, bringing nutrients to the surface and improving plant growth. This benefits not just native flora, but also agriculture. Moreover, their burrows provide shelter for dozens of other animals, many of which couldn't survive without them. Take the burrowing owl, for example. It rarely digs its own burrow, preferring instead to live in old prairie dog tunnels. The same goes for golden-mantled ground squirrels, rabbits, and even reptiles. Larger predators like foxes, coyotes, and badgers rely on prairie dogs as a food source. And then there's the case of the black-footed ferret. Once thought extinct, this elusive carnivore was rediscovered in 1981. Since then, efforts have been made to reintroduce the ferret across parts of the US, Canada, and Mexico. But conservationists learned that ferret reintroduction couldn't succeed without first restoring prairie dog populations, because 90% of a black-footed ferret's diet is prairie dogs. So in many areas, prairie dogs were reintroduced first. Only then were ferrets brought back. By 2015, ferret populations had reached more than 200 individuals across 18 sites in Arizona, South Dakota, and Wyoming. Even animals that don't eat prairie dogs benefit from their presence. An ecological study in New Mexico's Cevalita National Wildlife Refuge demonstrated this clearly. Researchers reintroduced prairie dogs into a 22-acre patch of grassland. Nearby, they left an identical grassland untouched. Burrowing owls, rabbits, badgers, and birds of prey flocked to the area with prairie dogs. The identical grassland next door? Virtually empty. Let's take a detour to Pueblo, Colorado, home to the U.S. Army's chemical depot. You might assume this site once used to store nearly 800,000 munitions and over 2,600 tons of mustard agent would be barren. But surprisingly, it's home to one of the oldest undisturbed shortgrass prairies in the state. Why? Because the land, fenced off for security reasons, was left untouched for decades. And within it, a population of prairie dogs continued to thrive, supporting burrowing owls, golden eagles, foxes, and more. It's a strange twist. The same animal once poisoned and persecuted across the continent was quietly keeping one of the last strongholds of prairie biodiversity alive on a former chemical weapons site. Today, there's growing awareness of the prairie dog's role in restoring grassland ecosystems. But challenges remain. Some ranchers still view them as pests. Urban sprawl continues to chip away at their habitat, and climate change adds yet another layer of pressure. Still, their story is a hopeful one. Across North America, scientists, conservationists, and communities are coming together to give prairie dogs another chance. From the deserts of Mexico to the plains of Arizona and Colorado, they are reclaiming their role as guardians of the prairie. And the results speak for themselves. Once seen as vermin, prairie dogs are now viewed as ecological engineers, creatures that can heal the land simply by doing what they've always done: burrow, graze, and build homes for their neighbors. In saving prairie dogs, we just might save the prairies themselves.